Imagine waking up one day and realizing that everything you took for granted about language, how it structures thoughts, how it defines reality, might just be accidental. That the way you describe the world isn't the natural way, it's simply one way, shaped by history, habit, and the quirks of your mother tongue. This was the exhilarating, slightly vertigo-inducing realization that hit early linguists like Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Whorf in the early 20th century. Studying languages that operated on completely different rules from English, German, or French, they found themselves questioning everything. Does language shape the way we think? Does it limit what we can imagine? Today, we're diving into a chapter from Guy Deutscher's Through the Language Glass, a book that traces the rise and fall and possibly redemption of this big idea. We'll talk about what Sapir and Whorf got wrong, what they might have gotten right, and why people still argue about whether language is just a tool or a lens that subtly yet powerfully distorts reality. And of course, we'll ask the question that really matters. What does all of this mean for you? Someone navigating life in a second language. Does learning English mean thinking differently? Does it change who you are? What's the deal? Let us find out. So let us rewind to 1924. Edward Sapir, one of the biggest names in American linguistics, makes an observation that still rings true today. He says essentially that nobody outside the field cares about language. They see it as a tool, nothing more. French, useful because there are French books to read. Greek, maybe if you're into dramatic tragedy, but grammar, case systems, verb conjugations, that's just academic busywork, something only frigid and dehumanized pedants care about. Or is it? Sapir, along with his student, Benjamin Lee Whorf, saw something much bigger. They believed that language wasn't just about expressing thoughts. It actively shaped them. That the way a language is structured, what it forces you to pay attention to, what distinctions it makes or ignores, all of that alters the way its speakers see the world. And to them, the most mind-blowing evidence came from Native American languages, which did things that seemed completely alien to English or French or German speakers. Picture this. In English, we say the stone falls. Simple, right? You have an object, stone, and you have an action, fall. But in Nootka, a language spoken on Vancouver Island, you cannot break it down that way. Instead, you have to say something like, it stones down. The motion isn't something that's separate from the stone, it's part of it. So Sapir and Whorf started thinking, okay, if languages carve up reality in such wildly different ways, does that mean their speakers actually think differently? Could your mother tongue be a kind of invisible force field that shapes how you perceive time, space, and even reality itself? This is where things get tricky, because while this idea, what became known as the Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis, sounds exciting, it also gets kind of overhyped. Whorf, who takes things to a whole new level, argues that Hopi in Native American language doesn't have tenses the way English does. No clear past, present, and future. And from that, he concludes that Hopi speakers must not think about time the way we do, that they don't see time as a smooth, flowing thing, like a river or a timeline. Instead, time for them is something else entirely, something cyclical that's tied to events rather than an abstract past, present, or future. This claim was a sensation. People ran with it. It made its way into philosophy, anthropology, even pop culture. The idea that language could literally shape the way people understood time, reality, even physics, was too good to resist. But then, linguist Eckhard Malotki actually studied Hopi in depth and published a 677-page book titled Hopi Time that basically said Whorf got it completely wrong. The Hopi do talk about time, and they have tenses, and they make distinctions between past, present, and future, just like everyone else. Whorf's grand claim, a mix of wishful thinking and bad research. And this is where the whole language shapes thought idea kind of takes a nosedive. People hear about Whorf's mistakes and assume that the whole theory must be nonsense. They roll their eyes and move on. But hold on, because while strong linguistic relativity, the idea that language completely determines thought, might be dead, a weaker, much more interesting version is still very much alive. Here's where things get fun again, because maybe language doesn't trap us in different realities. Maybe it doesn't dictate what we can or cannot think. But what if it nudges us? What if it quietly steers our attention in ways that we do not even realize? Think about this. In English, we say, I spent yesterday evening with a neighbor. In French or German, though, I have to tell you whether that neighbor was a man or a woman. Well, again, in 2025, it might be a lot more than that. There's a ton of possibilities. But there's a specificity to it. There's no neutral way around it. On the flip side, in Chinese, you don't have to specify whether an event happened in the past, present, or future the way you do in English. Does that force people to think differently? Maybe not. But does it shape what they pay attention to? What they get used to noticing? Quite possibly yes. And this matters because if you're living your life in a second language, like many of you listening, it means that shifting into English might not just be about learning new words and sounds. It might also be subtly changing what you focus on, what feels natural to express. Let's get into some real-world examples of how language might subtly shape our thoughts, not in some dramatic mind control way, but in tiny nudges that add up over time. Let's start with color. For the longest time, people assumed that color was just there, a universal experience. You and I see red, we call it red. Simple. But then linguists started noticing something odd, and a lot of my Russian-speaking listeners will know what it's all about before I even say it. Some languages don't divide up the color spectrum the way English does. Russian, for example, has two completely separate words for light blue, голубой, and dark blue, синий. It's not just blue, they are different colors. And here's where it gets interesting. Studies have shown that Russian speakers are actually faster at distinguishing shades of blue than English speakers. Their language pushes them to notice a distinction that English just sort of glosses over, and not just English. Now, does this mean that English speakers are colorblind to the difference? Of course not. If you just go on and point it out, then yeah, we see it just fine. But language creates habits, and it subtly directs our attention, and that is the key. Another fun one, direction. If you speak English, you say things like left and right without thinking twice. But in some Aboriginal Australian languages, you cannot use those words. Instead, everything is described in cardinal directions: north, south, east, west. So instead of saying, pass me the cup on your right, you'd have to say, pass me the cup east of where you're sitting. Sounds wild, kind of, but here's the kicker. Speakers of these languages have an uncanny sense of direction. Even in unfamiliar places, they instinctively know which way is north or south. Their language constantly forces them to be aware of it, to pay attention to it. It's not that language blocks us from thinking certain thoughts, what we naturally pay attention to. The things we notice first, the details we include without effort, the little mental shortcuts we take. And this is where it gets personal for those of us living life in another language. Because when you switch languages, you're not swapping words. You're subtly shifting your focus. You're stepping into a different way of organizing information. You're entering a new rhythm of thought. Ever feel like you have a slightly different personality in English than in your first language? Like maybe you're a little more direct, a little more expressive, a little less tied to certain social norms. That's not just in your head, it's the influence of the language itself. There's this famous experiment where bilinguals were asked to describe themselves in two different languages. And guess what? Their answers changed depending on the language that they were speaking. And as far as I'm concerned, on what language they were living certain experiences in. In English, they'd highlight independence, personal achievements, that sort of thing. In Spanish, they'd talk more about family and community. Same people, different linguistic lenses. Me, for instance, I work in English, I socialize in English when offline, I do a lot of Russian-speaking socializing online, I've done a lot of studying in both Russian and English, and at home I speak a melange of languages. I rarely stick to one. I sometimes feel I exist in this third space, the headspace in between languages, and then depending on the context, I'm pulled in either direction. It doesn't help my ADHD, by the way. It kind of makes things more complicated. So what does this mean for you? If you ask me, it means that every time you speak English, you're not just using a tool, you're stepping into a different mental space. That's really powerful, because if language can in fact shape habits of mind, then mastering a new language isn't just about fluency. It's about expanding the way you see the world. It's about stretching the way you express yourself. And maybe, just maybe, it's about discovering new sides of who you are. So if you ever feel like English is reshaping you in ways you don't fully understand, that's because it is. And honestly, that's kind of exciting. So keep on observing yourself. And don't forget to get back to me on what it is that you've observed. That is for today's episode. If this got you thinking, or if you have your own experience of feeling different in English, send me a message. I'd love to hear from you. And if you're enjoying the podcast, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a friend who's also navigating life in another language. Again, be sure to stay tuned for my announcement of the upcoming workshop on how to navigate rhythm and intonation in English, and how to easily walk into that English-speaking and English-feeling mental space through adopting an English-sounding musicality. Until next time, keep speaking, keep exploring, and keep noticing the little shifts that language brings. Talk soon. This was Beyond the Accent with Carrie.